Summary of Going After Cacciato by Tim O'Brien. Paul Berlin, a young, inexperienced soldier, narrates going after Cacciato, which jumps between numerous time periods. When the book starts, Berlin and the other troops with whom he is fighting are in the middle of a terrible war in Vietnam. Lieutenant Corson, an old, sick, and sometimes forgetful man, and Oscar Johnson, a young, angry officer, are in charge of Berlin. One day in October 1968, the soldiers find out that Cacciato, a happy, simple-minded, and possibly mentally disabled soldier, has gone missing. He had told Berlin that he was going to walk to Paris, but he was never seen again. Before Cacciato gets too far away, the troops decide to go after him. Doc Parrott, the army doctor, and Harry Murphy, who uses the squad's big rifle, both tell Corson that they should go back instead of risking their lives for one deserter. Corson wants them to keep going. Cacciato leads the soldiers to a hill, but they can't catch him before a smoke bomb goes off. The troops try to catch Cacciato that night while he is sleeping on a hill. Before we can find out what happens, the chapter ends. When the story picks up again, 2 days have passed, and the troops are still chasing Cacciato through the bush. Many of the parts of the book take place at a strange observation post that looks out over the seas of Vietnam, after the soldiers have come back from chasing Cacciato. Berlin, who is on night watch, thinks about Cacciato's crazy plan to walk to Paris. He also wonders how Cacciato stayed free for so long. He comes to the conclusion that going from Vietnam to Paris was possible, not likely, but possible. As he sits at the observation post, Berlin also thinks about his complicated bond with his mother and father. He remembers trying hard, but usually failing, to win his father's love. He also remembers very well calling his parents from Vietnam and being crushed when neither of them answered. Berlin also thinks back to June 1968, when he first joined the army. He was part of the 198th Infantry Unit, which, in real life, was the unit that saw and in some cases took part in the My Lai massacre. O'Brien also served in the 198th Infantry Brigade. Lieutenant Sidney Martin, who was in charge of him, was a proud and cocky man who quickly turned his men against him. When the men found a secret Viet Cong tunnel, Martin made them clear the tunnel before they threw bombs into it. Many of Berlin's friends died while he was clearing sewers because it was a dangerous job. The troops grew to dislike Martin because he always insisted on following the same rules. Berlin and the other troops are still after Cacciato at the end of October 1968. Harold Murphy has left the others and left his big gun behind because he doesn't want to put his life in risk by going after Cacciato. The last few troops meet a young woman and her 2 aunts one day. The young woman, Sarkin Ang Wan, says that they are trying to leave the country and find safety in the far west. Berlin thinks Sarkin is very pretty. Corson lets the 3 women go with the troops as they go after Cacciato, but he warns them that they will have to go their own way as soon as they reach a town. The narrator says that Stink Harris, one of Berlin's fellow soldiers, almost catches Cacciato but gets hurt by him and has to let him go. Cacciato is still being chased through Laos by the soldiers, who are still being helped by Sarkin and her uncles. There, they fall through a hole and end up in a strange network of tubes underground. Sarkin's aunts don't seem to have made it out of the hole, but this is never said for sure. As the troops crawl through the tunnels, they meet a man who says his name is Lee Van Gogh, or Van. Van says that he is a Viet Cong soldier who is being held in the Viet Cong's huge network of bunkers because he tried to leave the army. Van won't let the men leave because they are on opposite sides of the war. Corson tells the soldiers to tie up Van and destroy everything in his room. The troops leave Van and try, but mostly fail, to find their way out of the caves. Sarkin says to the men all of a sudden, the way in is the way out. With this, she pulls the men toward her, and they fall out of the tunnels and into the city of Mandalay. In Mandalay, the men stay in a hotel and spend their days trying to find Cacciato in the city. During this time, Berlin and Sarkin fall in love. Sarkin tells Berlin that they should try to get to Paris and then live there for the rest of their lives. Berlin sees Cacciato dressed like a priest one day. Berlin tries to arrest Cacciato, but a group of Cacciato's new friends, who are also dressed as priests, beat him up, and Cacciato gets away from the soldiers again. Sarkin tells Berlin that she saw Cacciato run to the next train to Delhi. Because of this, the troops bring Sarkin with them as they chase Cacciato to Delhi. The troops stay at the Hotel Phoenix in Delhi, where they spend their days looking for Cacciato. Lieutenant Corson makes friends with Hamahali Chand, or Jolly for short, a young and beautiful hotel worker. Jolly cooks a wonderful meal for the troops in Sarkin, and she tells them that she went to school in Baltimore for 2 years. Corson seems to like Jolly more and more. A few days later, Doc Parate finds a picture of Cacciato getting on a train to Kabul, Afghanistan, in the newspaper. Even though the men need to go to Kabul, Corson won't go with them. Instead, he and Jolly will stay behind. The troops seem to agree with Corson's choice, but when he gets very drunk later that night, they have to take him to the train. When Corson wakes up, he finds that he is leaving Delhi. He is very upset, but he knows he has to move on. In flashbacks, the storyteller shows how Lieutenant Corson became in charge of his men. Lieutenant Sidney Martin was a good leader, but he did things that put the lives of his men in danger. Viet Cong troops in the caves killed several soldiers, including Bernie Lin and Frenchie Tucker, because Martin wouldn't let them break the rules. Oscar Johnson suggested to the other troops that they get rid of Sidney Martin instead of waiting for the Viet Cong to shoot him. Johnson gives a bomb to each of his fellow troops, and when they touch it, it shows that they agree with Johnson's plan. Cacciato is the only man who did not touch the bomb. Johnson sends Berlin to Cacciato to get his help. Everyone thinks Cacciato is a fool because he feels the bomb when Berlin hands it to him, but it's never clear if Cacciato knows what he's voting for. Shortly after that, Lieutenant Martin dies, probably because Johnson killed him, and Lieutenant Corson is brought in to replace him. Back in the present, the troops in Sarkin go through Kabul and then on to Tehran. It's Christmas in 1968, and to enjoy, the troops drink booze and play cards. In Tehran, the troops are taken into custody because they were going without the right ID. They are taken to a jail, where they meet Captain Ralin, a young and smart Iranian soldier. When Ralin asks the troops in Iran what they are doing there, Doc, who is quick on his feet, says that they are trying to catch Cacciato in Paris according to the Geneva Codes. Ralin believes this lie and agrees that American forces have the right to move through other countries without passports. Even at night, he takes the men out to drink. A few weeks after the first time the soldiers met Ralin, they were taken into custody again. This time, Ralin tells the soldiers that they are in big trouble because they have no proof that they are on a mission to find Cacciato, and the American embassy in Iran doesn't know anything about American forces from Vietnam going through the Middle East. The soldiers in Sarkin are put in jail and told they will be killed in the morning. Berlin is having a crazy dream. When he wakes up, the troops are using bombs to blow up the door to their jail cell. They run out of the jail, find a car, and drive out of the country, away from the prison. The troops drive from Tehran to Izmir, where they plan for a boat to take them to Athens. The boat ride goes smoothly, except on the last day, when the troops are shocked to see armed police officers waiting for them at the dock, ready to arrest them. Stink Harris is so scared that he jumps off the boat to avoid being caught. Surprisingly, the other troops land and sneak past the other soldiers without being seen. The troops look all over Athens for Cacciato, but they don't find much. They rode with a girl from California through Yugoslavia. The forces drive through Luxembourg on their way to Paris from Yugoslavia. When the men get to Paris, they find a beautiful city that is just as nice as they had imagined. The beauty of the city really strikes Berlin and Sarkin. Even though they are looking for Cacciato, the troops are mostly happy to be living in Paris. The reporter says that money isn't a problem. They rent rooms in a hotel. Berlin and Sarkin fall in love with Paris so much that they want to buy an apartment there and quit the army for good. Berlin tells Corson that he wants to leave the army for good, and Corson, to Berlin's surprise, agrees. Corson says that the troops have already quit the army and were just acting to follow a mission by going to Paris. When Berlin goes back to his hotel to get the last of his things so he can move in with Sarkin, he sees his fellow soldiers, including Corson, waiting outside. Doc tells Berlin that the police have once again caught up with them. The only way for them to avoid going to jail is to bring Cacciato's body, which is probably dead, and show that their task was a good one. In the days to come, Berlin and the other people will spend a lot of time looking for Cacciato. One day, Berlin meets Cacciato at a market in the open air. He follows Cacciato to a hotel and writes down the room number and address of the hotel. Berlin runs back to tell the other troops, but he is surprised to find out that Corson and Sarkin have run away together. Oscar Johnson is now in charge of the troops, and he tells them to set up a trap for Cacciato in the middle of the night. That night, the troops, except for Lieutenant Corson, rush to Cacciato's hotel. Oscar Johnson yells at Berlin and tells him to bring the big gun into the hotel and take care of Cacciato with it. Berlin and the other troops walk into the hotel. Berlin is so scared that he is almost frozen. When he gets to Cacciato's room, the door is open, which surprises him. Inside, he falls to the floor, but not before firing a few shots into the dark. In the last few pages of the book, the narrator goes back to the day in October 1968 when Berlin and the other troops were meant to catch Cacciato at the hill in Vietnam. Even though the storyteller doesn't say exactly what happened when Berlin tried to arrest Cacciato, it seems likely that Berlin shot and killed Cacciato by accident. Corson says that Cacciato is missing in action because he feels bad about Berlin's mistake. After that, Berlin and Doc talk about how they might be moved to an observation post overlooking the sea, which would be a safe and secure place. At the observation post, it seems like Berlin has been daydreaming about an alternate timeline in which Cacciato runs all the way to Paris. In this alternate timeline, the events of the book happen before Cacciato leaves. Berlin and Lieutenant Corson talk about the idea that Cacciato might have made it from Vietnam to Paris. Corson is in agreement with Berlin that the possibilities of Cacciato becoming successful were low, but it was not impossible for him to do so.
About the author. Tim O'Brien was born in 1946 in Austin, Minnesota, but he grew up in Worthington, Minnesota. As a child, he was very interested in nature and travel, which are also common themes in his books and short stories. O'Brien went to college to study politics. Soon after he graduated from high school in 1968, he was sent to Vietnam to serve in the army for almost 2 years. O'Brien was in the section that took part in the notorious My Lai massacre, see below, but he didn't get to Vietnam until almost a year after this happened. After his time in the war, he went to Harvard University to study writing. In 1973, he published his first book, If I Die in a Combat Zone, Box Me Up and Ship Me Home, which was a biography. The book has been called the best book ever written about Vietnam. It has been praised by a small but impressive number of critics. During the 1970s and 1980s, O'Brien kept writing books and short stories. Most of them were about or made references to the Vietnam War. Going After Cacciato, his book from 1978, was praised by critics and got the National Book Award, which is one of the greatest honors an American writer can get. In the 1980s, O'Brien was an active supporter of better care for soldiers and a critic of the way the U.S. government handled its war actions abroad. The Things They Carried, the book for which O'Brien is best known, came out in 1990. The book was a collection of short stories about Vietnam, many of which O'Brien had written and released in the 10 years before. It got a lot of praise and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award. In the Lake of the Woods, Tomcat in Love, and July are O'Brien's 3 books released since 1990.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.